Hey friends, welcome back to the Invitation Podcast. This is Season 2, Episode 7, and Part
3
of our Moses series. We've got a lot to dive into today. Hopefully you had a chance to check out the last episode. We're going to continue on that journey, and we're glad you're here.
Yeah, definitely make sure to check out the first 2 episodes of this Moses series, because this one will make a lot of sense. But yeah, if you're listening in for the first time on this one, you can also just check this one out. A quick summary of the last episode to transition us in. We looked at Moses and his first of 5 questions he brings to God at the burning bush. And he says, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" And really kicks off this whole series as far as identity with God, identity in God. This whole journey will be a journey of identity. And he discovers, and we discovered through our conversation, that our identity isn't so wrapped up in what we do or what we believe, but really is with God's presence with us. And yet, we are able to worship him and trust him through our doubts. We don't have to eliminate our doubts first before achieving our identity. Our identity unfolds and ensues as he pursues us. And properly aligning and ordering that is really important to our identity. And Moses gets that lesson from God as well. So today, Kyle, we're going to be looking at Exodus 3, verses 13, 14, and 15. We're going to look at the first 2 verses for the first half. We'll look at verse 15 for the second half. And we'll dig into a second question around identity formation.
Let's do it.
All right. So Exodus 3, verses 13 and 14. Moses said to God, "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' Then what shall I tell them?" God said to Moses, "I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you." All right, so first off in this passage, Kyle, I just love that Moses says, "Suppose I go." On a scale of 1 to 10, how committed does Moses sound right now to you, Kyle?
Oh man, I've heard these things from a certain son of mine.
Oh, jeez.
Well, what if we did my plan?
Right.
What if?
Right. Yeah, you can have a snack if you go clean up the playroom. Well, what if I have the snack first? Or suppose I don't clean up and have the snack first.
Oh, classic.
And it's classic because this is, I love that we both brought up childlike responses.
Yeah.
Because in a certain sense, obviously Moses is not sold on the mission that we covered 2 episodes ago.
Right.
Of God being passionate about the redemption of the Israelites under the oppressive rule of Egypt and sending Moses to go accomplish that mission.
Right.
And even though we identified that Moses has those passions, he still has these, if you will, childlike fears and anxieties.
Well, he's got some baggage to back it up.
That's true.
But for sure.
Yeah. Being a convicted fugitive murderer will do something to you. Right? And so I don't mean to say childlike in the sense of bashing Moses.
Right.
But in the sense that in our identity formation, there's going to be a maturation that needs to take place.
Yeah.
And this gets back to last episode. We're kind of doing a recap this way, right? Where it's not just one time I've chosen to follow God and now I've got my whole identity in God.
Check.
Yeah, it is an unfolding and ensuing. It's a maturing.
Yes.
And so Moses is right in this raw place, but he's being honest at least. Suppose I go. It shows a level of honesty too.
Yeah.
Any other observations on suppose I go?
Yeah, I mean, I think Moses would have made a great salesman. He's kind of going for the soft close there, I suppose, right? Trying to get a look at, what could be on the other side of his acceptance for this mission.
Yeah. Yep. And so the question that he attaches to this suppose I go statement, right? So he throws the suppose I go out there, but it gets covered up pretty quickly in the main question here is, what is his name? What is this God's name? Now, for us, 21st century Western hemisphere most likely listening to this podcast, we don't spend too much time on our God's name. Every now and then there'll be this season going around of the many names of God, or like the many meanings of Jesus, and especially around Christmas time with Emmanuel, God with us, things like that. So it's not to say we spend zero time on thinking about our God's name. However, the contrast here is that in Moses' time, polytheism wasn't one religious view, it was the religious view. And as mind-boggling as this might even sound, even for the Israelites,
right,
it was a default religious view that there were many gods, but Yahweh would become the greatest. I spilled some beans there about God's name, but our God is the greatest.
right.
And slowly over Old Testament time into New Testament time, monotheism becomes the thing.
Right.
And that takes a lot of unpacking. There's a lot of resources I could point you to, but you can Google that one too and find out like polytheism in ancient Israelite times. But it's important to know this, that when Moses is saying, suppose I go to them and they ask, what's this God's name?
Sure.
That's a common question. That's not some sort of out of left field question.
Right. Yeah, boots on the ground. Then you talking about the Egyptians too, which that culture obviously had a huge impact at that time, and that's what they practiced was polytheism.
Yep, and they just spent 400 years as a nation under the oppressive rule of Egypt.
That'll have a little bit of an impact.
Yeah, and they had a polytheistic culture that mainly worshipped, the highest of the gods was the sun god, Ra, to my own understanding and research, but there were other gods too, gods of fertility, gods of fruitfulness, God of the Nile, I'm sure, right? They had all these different gods, but it was always Ra, the sun god, that was most important. So when Moses is saying, if I'm going to be empowered by the gods, which God? Which God am I representing? Which God are the Israelites going to be representing? Gosh, Kyle, there's a deep dive we could go back to on image bearing in this one, but I'll just reference you back to those episodes back in season 1. The important part of this is this question might sound off to us, but it's not off to Moses, to the Israelites. It's direly important to be able to say, the sun God has sent me, the rain God, the Nile God. However, this God, when Moses asks his name, says, I am who I am. So Kyle, go back to maybe the first time you ever met me, and you say, hey, my name's Kyle, what's your name? And I go, I am who I am. Well, what would that say?
Awkward.
Okay, yeah, let's live into this one a little bit. Yeah. So what are some of the things that come across as far as an impression that might leave on you?
Yeah, like who is this guy? Is he mentally stable? Does he have a greater sense of self than maybe he should? What does he have a name?
Sure.
Does he not like his name? All sorts of crazy stuff.
Yeah, it definitely comes across as smug at the very least.
Yeah,
I am who I am.
Yeah,
right. And yet, a name is so. I don't know if we've reflected on this in any of our episodes, but names mean a lot now.
Yeah.
I mean, we both have 2 kids. I'm sure we both poured over each of their names before deciding on them.
And I think it's fun. If you ever want to get down a rabbit hole there, that's a fun one. I think that a lot of folks today, discount, or they go to, hey, that's a cool name. I think family names can be important, but I think what you're getting at here is names are not only important, but they also impart a lot of meaning. You dive pretty deep down that rabbit hole, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Meaning and destiny.
Yeah, well, I didn't want to say it because I thought that really opened things up. But yeah.
Yes, it does. And especially in biblical times, right? Yeah. So Jacob meaning one that grasps the heel, which was an idiom for being a trickster, is really important, and not only sets the stage for what his childhood would be like, but the whole course of his life is going to have this trickster nature to it, and yet God loves him.
Yeah.
There's countless examples biblically, and you're right. We definitely, I think we spend a lot of time on names, and yet it's still not the level of effort and meaning that we put in names. I would say it would still be subpar compared to what the Bible and biblical times treated them as.
Oh yeah.
And it's fun. It's fun to be able to name something. I think we did spend a little time on this on the speed dating one, where Adam names all the animals and all that. I think we spent a little time on that. Speaking of, there's a bunny that comes right out our door, and one of my kids wants to name it Hoppy.
Yeah.
Another Hopper. I want Bryce Hopper. For Bryce Harper, because I'm a Phillies fan.
Yeah.
I had to squeeze that in here.
We can't do Hopper because Hopper was the mean grasshopper in A Bug's Life, so that doesn't work.
I don't know if my kids know that one.
Oh man. The ants grow the food.
Oh, that's right. The
grasshoppers eat the food.
That's right. They definitely don't remember that.
Okay.
But so here's the point, right? Even just that name characterized something so deep to you, but it didn't to us. And now here's God saying, I am who I am, doesn't provide a name.
Yeah.
So think about the letdown that Moses just has. Oh, okay, you just tell me what your name is, and I will go there with confidence. And God does not let Moses off the hook.
No.
Your confidence can't come just from a name.
Yeah.
It's got to come from something much deeper. You're not going to be able, this is from last episode, you're not going to be able to just check off the box of having this God with this name, and now you've got your identity formed. It's got to come from something deeper, and it's not going to come from boxing me into just being the God of the sun, the God of the rain, the God of fertility, any of those things. You cannot box this God in and expect to just achieve something by that.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that? I have one more thought on that before we move on, but any thoughts from your end on that, or any questions?
It just opens up so many more questions. I like the fact that this is actually answered in a little bit, so I'll just say that. Bear with us.
Yeah. We still do this a little bit today in the sense that we get this, oh man, I'll be direct here. I'm not normally this direct, but we get this pompousness about being a Christian sometimes. Yeah. Well, I'm a Christian. It's obvious that we believe this. And then you go across the street to the other denomination. Well, I'm a Christian, and it's obvious that we believe this.
Yeah.
And that's, this passage here is actually kind of alluding to a God who's bigger than any box we put him in, by any definitions we put him in.
I love that.
And we should be humbled by this interaction that Moses has with God in this moment when we come across these denominational bylines or these theologies, these histories. These things are here to help us. I don't want to blast denominationalism or theologies or anything like that.
I probably will do more blasting of that than you, but the point is still relevant here. That God's bigger than these things. Let's not get lost on our way to unity in a way that divides us unnecessarily.
That's right. Yep. And these things help point us to who God is, not limit God to who he is. And
that's a good way.
Without thinking it, get trapped sometimes. So go ahead and participate in your denomination and participate in theology and be enriched and learn from that. Don't ever be confined by it. Remain curious, remain open. That's one of the things that's happening in this interaction between God and Moses.
Yeah.
So with that, this passage takes a funny turn here. And so it goes from this I am who I am, this kind of awkward interchange around God's name, to suddenly, in verse 15, God also said to Moses. So it feels kind of like a rare moment in the Bible, to be honest, where it's like, God said this, and he also said this. Like normally it's just, here's what God said.
Yeah.
And so I think we're meant to do what we just did, actually. I think we're meant to pause and say, there's something rich here in the I am who I am statement. And now God is about to express his name.
Yeah.
Which, again, this is really strange. For God to not do something and then to immediately do it. Is strange, and we should really pay attention.
Well, there's a question, right? We should pay attention. We should ask the question, and the question here is, what are you trying to tell us from this? and that's where we get into some of those fun pieces that we just touched on.
Yes, and some new fun ones in the next verse here. So in verse 15, it says, God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name by which I am to be remembered from generation to generation. And there's actually another dozen verses after this in this question, the second of 5 questions that Moses asks. We're not going to cover the rest of that context, but we are going to stick here with this part where he says, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, has come to you. And the Lord is actually a title. And if you happen to be reading this passage, the Lord is in all caps, Lord. And it's actually a translation of Yahweh. Now, Yahweh, Kyle, I'm about to nerd out. So you and the listeners, just bear with me. And if you get lost in the clouds as you're listening to this, I apologize, but I will land it here on a point. But Yahweh is actually what theologians call the tetragrammaton. Have you ever played Tetris?
Yes.
In Tetris, all of the pieces are characterized by having 4 sections. Have you ever noticed that?
No.
So like the long piece is like 4 pixels. The L piece is 3 and then 1.
Okay.
The S piece is 2 stacked on 2. The box is 2. And so we get that because it's a Latin term for 4. There's the math degree, I think, working.
Okay.
So tetra means 4. Yep. Grammatron basically just means consonants. Okay. Consonants pushed together. So the tetragrammaton is our big nerdy theology word from today. And in English, that is YHWH. I'm going to do a quick pause here to say that the reason why it gets translated the Lord is actually kind of a head nod to Jewish culture around this. Jewish culture really takes seriously one of the 10 commandments that says, do not use the Lord's name in vain, so much so that they will not traditionally utter this name out loud, and instead they will say something like Adonai or the
even
king.
in text, like they won't spell out G-O-D, they'll say G dash or
That's
G
right.
underscore D. Pretty seriously followed.
Yeah, and man, we could do a whole episode on revering the name of God. That's not this episode right now. This is a hint at that. But when I was a little hesitant to actually utter Yahweh in this particular episode, but I think it makes a good enough teaching point to say we need to cover this here, because when you read your Bible and you come across, especially in the Old Testament, happens a few times in the New Testament, but in the Old Testament, you see these capital letters, the Lord. It's actually the name Yahweh being translated. And so in this particular passage, and now I'm coming back off my nerdy cloud. So in this particular passage, when you see the Lord, the God of your fathers, has come to you, really, it's God finally expressing his name.
Yeah.
And when he expresses his name, even though we pronounce it Yahweh, or sometimes we've added vowels and pronunciation of those consonants to say Jehovah, if you've ever heard that word, that's just Yahweh with some vowels in it.
I actually never knew that.
So there's a new one.
Yep. Something new today.
Yep. And so it's a more Englishized pronunciation of that. And we do these things out of respect for God, Jewish culture, things like that.
Yep.
The understanding of how the tetragrammaton would have been pronounced, it would have very much sounded like breath. And so he goes from Moses saying, what's your name? And God saying, I am who I am. And it's almost like Moses is like, no, for real. Can you tell me your name? And then he would have heard something akin to,
wow.
Yeah. So let's dig into this one a little bit, Kyle. It's your first time meeting me, and you're like, hey, my name's Kyle. What's your name? And I go, what are some thoughts there?
Run.
Run.
So yeah, on a personal standpoint, wild. But if you had any inkling of who you're speaking with, the depth there behind breath and the implications of breath, regardless of whether you're exploring that from a conservative Christian background or more of an Eastern tradition. In any way you slice it and dice it, breath is important. Breath is intimate. Breath is life giving, and
Mm-hmm.
so the layers here go about as deep as you want to take them.
Yes. And I'm glad that you stated it that way, where it's like in any context.
Yeah.
So even irreligious,
Right.
uh, take the worst of emergency scenarios. Breath is vital, right? Like, are they breathing? Is their heart pumping? Like we hold breath in such reverence. That's one of two things we check on in an emergency situation. But then also the way we describe a moment that feels ecstatic. It took my breath away,
Yeah.
right? Or the moment that we're trying to calm down. Catch your breath. There's so many ways that breath is so much more than a trope. It's the way that we actually think through how serious is this situation, how lighthearted is this situation.
Yeah.
I laughed so hard I couldn't breathe, right? I mean, there's so many ways that breath ties into things objectively,
Right.
irreligiously, but then religiously as well. And in our own context here, breath goes all the way back to Genesis 2, because of course it does. And the formation of the man, and it shouldn't be surprising to us that in a moment of identity discourse,
Right.
that God says, my breath is going to be the word on your lips about my name as you represent it to other people.
Yeah.
So in Genesis 2, the man gets breathed into. This picture is when Moses goes back to Egypt, he breathes out God now.
Mm.
I love that. I love that at the beginning.
That's a nice little full circle image and representation.
And as Moses' identity is unfolding, God's identity is unfolding.
Right.
So God's identity goes from the one that breathes into a human to the one that's being breathed out by a human.
Yeah.
From the beginning of Genesis to the beginning of Exodus. And so one other thing about breath here is you can't grab it, you can't box it, right? I guess you could breathe into a jar and cap it really quick or whatever. But the idea here, I'm actually in my own devotions right now reading Ecclesiastes, and it starts out meaningless, everything is meaningless. And that word for meaningless is hevel, and it means wind, vapor, smoke. Smoke, everything is smoke. And the idea is you can't grasp it. You can't box it. You can't put one particular meaning on anything, let alone everything. And here God is again. First with I am who I am, and now with finally saying his name in its breath. There's no way Moses is going to be able to say, well, he's the God of the sun. He's the God of the rain.
Right.
I can't contain this God, but I'm being sent by him.
Right.
Right? So even this name can't be contained. It can't be made still. It can't be made into an idol. It's breath. Right. It's wind. It's spirit. And that's pretty amazing. So I've got one other thought on this passage. Any other thoughts on breath?
No, I mean, I think we've covered that one enough, and I think it's going to have an individual, meaning for everyone watching, which I think is fun. And I think this is one of those that just it's going to come back, right, when you're alone. If you're listening to this in the car, or you just get a moment of stillness after a long day, and catch yourself doing one of those. That's when I want this to come back to you in the stillness, and remember the remarkable nature not only of this God, but how he interacts with us in the most unexpected ways.
Man, that's really good. I'm glad you put some action to this, because it is remarkable that every breath we take tells the story of both Genesis 2 and Exodus 3. Like that alone is worth, if you're listening to this while you're driving home, stop in the driveway, stop in the car before you go in and see the kids and have the dog rush up on you or whatever, and focus on your breath for a second and realize God is telling his story through your breath.
Yeah.
And what that might mean for both his love of you, but your projection of God to the world is tied up in your breath. That's really good stuff, Kyle. And the last thing I want to say about this passage is this idea of the Lord, Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name by which I am to be remembered from generation to generation. So this idea of the generations past, right? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and to be remembered from generation to generation to generation. This is, well, I'll admit this is a take of mine, but I think I've heard others give this take. This idea of being both the God of the generations past and the God of generations forward, we would call that eternal life in today's terms. I am the God of eternal, abundant life. So again, not just the God of the sea, of the Nile, of the sand, of the garden, of the sun, of the rain. Anything and everything that has life, I am its life. And I'm being hesitant here a little bit because even that, I feel like I'm starting to box him in a little bit by words. And I don't mean to. And yet I feel like this is something of what God is trying to touch on is there's this life that was, this life that is, and this life that ever will be. And that is what I am to be remembered by.
Right.
And what I forgot to look up the reference of this, but one thing that I am sure touches on this in the New Testament is Jesus is arguing with a group called the Sadducees. The Sadducees were a group of Jewish religious leaders that did not believe in the resurrection of the dead, and they try and trap Jesus on this very topic of the resurrection of the dead. And Jesus tells them, I am the God of, how does he say? He says, God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. And the Sadducees get really mad at him for this because he's doing two things. Jesus is actually saying, I am Yahweh in the flesh, and God is the God of the living. Somehow, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob have tasted eternal life already.
That's
resurrection life already.
Mind blowing.
I'm not about to try and explain how or why or how that works or anything like that. Right. But Jesus says it.
Yeah. Well, I think it speaks to like this is when we try and grasp these concepts with our human minds, this is one of those looks into the wisdom of the Lord when he's sparring, verbally with the top religious leaders of the time. And not only does he do so skillfully, but he also brings such wisdom that we're able to now be enriched by how that plays out. And we're invited into a lot of that wisdom in retrospect, which we can then take to not only further appreciate and worship, but also, be able to further apply these things into our own lives, which is a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's really good. And it helps me. So I have this weird tendency in my mind to always be in some sort of like theological argument with a fictional character that doesn't actually exist in my life. That's what my inner monologue does. I don't know what yours might do, but my inner monologue is like, if I ever get asked this question, well, I'm going to crush them with this response and I'm going to do that. And really what it is it's me being tempted to be able to almost do like an inverse of this question. Well, I know who God is, and I'm going to tell you what his name is. And God has slowly been pruning me of that and crushing that part of my nature that says, I, Phil Schiavone, have a handle on
The
who God is.
apologetics of love versus the apologetics of a sword.
That's right.
Yeah.
I so quickly want to be right about God.
Yeah.
And God so quickly wants me to know that I don't need that.
Which, side note, apologetics, cool word. You probably have a better definition. Essentially, the defense of the faith.
That's right.
Faith?
The face.
The face. There's probably levels there, but yeah, the defense of the faith.
Yes, defense of the faith. Yeah. It's not an apology as like, I'm sorry. It's an apology as an explanation, which we often do when we apologize. We try and explain our side of things. And so that God, through a passage like this, is often trying to soothe me from needing to be all tense and anxious about defending him. How can I defend air or breath or wind or spirit? Who can defend the way air moves, the way wind blows? Why would we feel the need to? The air defends itself. The breath breathes itself. Whenever I have attempted meditation of any kind, I hate the part where you're supposed to just sort of observe your breath, because then I feel like I'm controlling it. And that's like the exact opposite thing you're supposed to do. And I've needed to do that for post-concussion health reasons and things like that. And I always, it takes me a while to get to that point where I'm only observing breath. And yet, if I don't try it, that's when my breath is just doing its thing. Right. And that's what God is like. Don't try. The moment you try and control it is the moment you realize you don't need to. And we're supposed to get to that point. And Moses is also feeling this as he says, suppose I go. What am I supposed to wield? Right? What am I supposed to wield? And God's like, just your breath, dude. The fact that you are, period. That's good. Not that you are a prince of Egypt. Not that you survived the oppression and the murder of all the children. Not that you have some title. Not that you're a fugitive. None of that. The fact that I am who I am, God says, and you just have to be you. Yeah,
that should be very freeing, and a big takeaway about this.
We'll actually go into it a lot more next episode. I just realized that as it came out of my mouth. We'll actually go deep into that exact part. So that's the reason why I'm cutting you off. I hope that's okay.
Teaser.
Don't mean to cut you off, but I'm like, oh crap, we're actually spilling into the next one. So.
And this one, we're probably already kicking this one. Yeah. Thanks for sticking around. Mm-hmm. We got more.
So, let's actually land the plane. So, this idea of God being eternal life, and somehow that's encapsulated, which it can't be, but somehow that's encapsulated in breath itself. And Moses is he's trying to get a name out of God, and he doesn't get one, then he sort of gets one. All of this is to help, and this is one of many points, but for our sake of this identity piece that we're looking at for 6 episodes here at least, is that we would be able to trust God before being able to define him. Oftentimes our whole lives in studying the Bible and going to Sunday school classes and listening to sermons and listening to podcasts is trying to be able to well, I'm speaking for myself here a little bit, but I want to learn more about God. I want to learn more, in the brain. I want to be able to define more. I want to have more bullet points. I want to have more apologetics. And God wants us to do that. Well, the Bible is thousands of pages long because he wants us to be able to learn more about him.
He welcomes that rigor.
Above that, beyond that, before that, he wants us to be able to trust him before we define him. You got some thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is not getting lost in this place of anxiousness and leaning into this anxiety of I have to know all the just like Moses in that last explanation, he gets sent out and he needs to trust that when he needs that next thing, when he has that next conversation or confrontation, that he's going to be properly equipped. And that's the same thing that we really want you guys to walk out of this with. if you're feeling anxious that I need to be able to have a definition, well, I think I'll bring it back to something we touched on in some of the early episodes. If you're looking at this process as anything other than relationship, you will find yourself going down many times that road of anxiety. However, if you look at this as a relationship, the first time you meet someone, you're not going to know everything about them, nor do you expect that. But you know that you like what you hear, you're able to trust, and you want to get to know more about this individual. And so I think that's really what I would leave you guys with on that piece is um, lean into the relationship, and I think that anxiety will start to fall away.
Yeah, thank you for putting it in relational terms. I appreciate that because I think I've been using a lot of like name terms and definition terms, and this is about a relationship between Moses and God, and then also between Moses and the very people he's so passionate about freeing
Right.
and redeeming. And that messed him up to the point that he murdered someone over those passions and broke relationship with his people.
Fired up dude.
The next person he encountered was like, are you going to murder me too? Right. So I really appreciate you bringing this back to relational terms for Moses, but also for myself and the listener here. So, one thing we're landing on here, right? Trusting God before being able to define him and seeing that play out in your relationship with God as well as your relationship with others. The other thing I want us to land on is as sure as our breath sustains us, he sustains us and more.
Yeah.
So not only is God sustaining us by his breath, his very name reminds us of our sustenance, our breath.
Yeah.
Our very breathing speaks his name. And so when we breathe, we're unconsciously worshiping God, naming God.
Yeah.
When our kids were born and they took that first breath, it was God breathing into them and them praising God. And when we breathe our last, Kyle, it'll be a praise.
Beautiful.
Right? So we often, every now and then I'll catch one of those memes where it's like all these famous dead people's last words, right? And no matter if they believed in God or not, their breath praised something to God for their very existence without them being acknowledging of it sometimes. I am fascinated by that on a theological, like ephemeral level. But do you have any other thoughts on like a practical level or a way this plays out every day?
No, I think I touched on it earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Just this is something that I hope that you're able to reflect on. We want this to be educational, but also relational, and I think part of that relationship is understanding some of those thoughts that you've held here for a long time, and start to be able to actually pull those out and reflect on them and ask yourself good questions as you build a trusted network around you. These are the types of important questions that arise because really from your identity so much more can be built on a solid foundation. So it's okay to spend some good time here.
Yeah, and we all have something that we're facing, some sort of challenge.
Yeah.
And I think I can say confidently too, we all have an instinct around what God might be calling us to that might stretch us or might challenge us or that might cause us to be anxious. And we would hope that this very podcast would help inform your response to that, to be able to say, man, even just a focus on my breath here for a little bit will help center me on who God is,
right,
and who he's calling me to be. And without being able to define either, without being able to define exactly what God's going to do in that challenging situation or exactly how I'm going to handle it, something of God is going to shine through me in that, and something of God is going to come out of this.
Yeah.
Oh, I can actually feel the chills on the own anxieties I have that I'm facing, some of the challenges
Well,
I'm
it's a
facing.
tuning in, right? Like picture this like a radio, and we're just finding that dial, and when we're tuned in, um, to Phil's point there, that's really going to reduce that anxiety because yeah, we all got stuff. Um, and this is the one thing that cuts through
Hmm.
that noise. And to your point, it's always there. It never
Yes.
left.
Yeah,
And we just need to teach ourselves to um, take that time and have that awareness. And,
that's right.
uh,
And use that awareness to remind us God
yes.
has been here the whole time.
Yeah.
He's been sustaining me and more.
Yeah.
He longs to redeem me and restore me, just like he's redeeming and restoring Moses and his calling.
Yep.
So,
It's good.
yeah, it's really good. Well, I'll close us on the invitation for this episode, which is may your identity be more wrapped up in who he is towards you rather than what you can say about him. Thanks for listening to the Invitation Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, kindly invite others, see what I did there, Kyle, to listen in by sharing it with a friend, posting about it on social media, or even leaving a rating and a review.
To catch all the latest and greatest, give us a follow on Instagram, Facebook, or X at The Invitation Pod, and help us share the invitation with others. Thanks again. We hope you'll tune in to future episodes.